My beloved child, something shifted quietly, and the person at the center of this message may not even have the words to explain why their heart suddenly feels lighter. What happened was not dramatic. There was no grand announcement, no perfect speech, no moment designed for anyone else to notice. It was something much smaller than that, something you finally did without realizing how deeply it could be felt. And that is why this happiness is different. It is not the excitement of receiving something new. It is the relief of finally recognizing something they had been waiting to see for longer than they ever admitted. Don't skip, because the most meaningful part is not what you did on the surface. It is what your action quietly told them about who you are becoming. For a long time, this person may have carried one private question whenever they thought about you. They may have wondered whether the connection between you could ever become calm enough to trust, clear enough to understand, and real enough to stop needing constant proof. They did not necessarily want a dramatic declaration. They were not secretly waiting for you to chase harder, speak louder, or perform some impossible gesture. Their hope was far simpler, and because it was simple, it was easy to miss. They wanted to see whether you could choose something from a genuine place inside yourself, without being pushed, without needing recognition, and without knowing whether they were watching. And somehow, recently, you did. Perhaps it appeared as patience where you once would have reacted. Perhaps it was the way you stopped forcing an answer and allowed something to breathe. Perhaps you finally protected your own peace instead of trying to control how another person responded. Maybe you spoke with a little more honesty. Maybe you became quieter. Maybe you stopped explaining yourself to everyone. Maybe you simply showed through your actions that your feelings could exist without becoming pressure. Whatever form it took, they noticed the difference. And what surprised them was how deeply that difference reached them. There are moments when happiness does not arrive as laughter. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting alone for a few seconds longer than usual because a realization has just landed inside them. Sometimes it is a smile they cannot explain. Sometimes it is the strange feeling of finally being able to imagine a future conversation without tension attached to it. That may be closer to what is unfolding here. Stay till the end, because there is another layer to this, and it explains why one seemingly ordinary change could matter so much. This person had secretly been waiting for evidence of emotional consistency. Not perfection. Not a flawless version of you. Consistency. They wanted to know whether the warmth they once felt from you could remain even when circumstances became uncertain. They wanted to know whether your kindness was still kindness when no reward followed it. They wanted to know whether you could care without abandoning yourself. And perhaps most importantly, they wanted to know whether the version of you they once believed existed was still there beneath everything that had happened. Then something changed. You made a choice they did not expect. You responded differently. You carried yourself differently. You did not repeat an old pattern. And without making a speech about it, you answered a question they had been keeping private. That is where the happiness came from. It was not only, they still care about me. It was something more mature than that. It was, they understood something. Those words matter, because being understood is often deeper than being pursued. A person can receive endless attention and still feel unseen. But when someone changes the way they move because they have genuinely learned from the past, it creates a different kind of emotional impact. Something important is waiting for you, because the story becomes even more personal here. What they were secretly waiting for may have been exactly the thing you once believed was too small to matter. Perhaps you stopped sending mixed signals. Perhaps you gave them room without turning cold. Perhaps you allowed your own life to keep moving instead of placing everything on pause. Perhaps you showed softness without losing strength. Perhaps you finally treated yourself with the same respect you had always been willing to give them. That last possibility may be the one they noticed most. Because when someone truly cares about you, watching you choose yourself in a healthy way does not necessarily push them away. Sometimes it does the opposite. It tells them that being close to you would no longer require either person to disappear inside the connection. And that realization can change everything about how the future feels. Imagine what that might have meant to them. They may have spent more time than you know wondering whether the two of you could ever meet again emotionally without recreating what once felt confusing. They may have remembered certain conversations, certain silences, certain moments when both of you wanted to say more but neither knew how to make the moment safe enough. Then they saw something in you that suggested the answer might finally be changing. You were not trying so hard to be understood. You were becoming understandable through the way you lived. That distinction is powerful. Words can promise growth. Behavior reveals it. And this person may have seen enough of your behavior lately to feel a hope they had been protecting from disappointment. Not certainty. Not fantasy. Hope. Quiet, realistic, surprising hope. There is another detail here that deserves your attention. The one thing they secretly waited for may not have been something you did for them at all. It may have been something you finally stopped doing to yourself. Think about that carefully. Maybe they watched you question your worth too many times. Maybe they sensed how quickly you blamed yourself when things became complicated. Maybe they knew you had a habit of giving more than you could comfortably carry. And somewhere inside them was the wish that one day you would stop measuring your value by whether another person chose you. Then, little by little, something in you became steadier. You stopped reaching for reassurance in the same way. You began carrying your own center. And strangely, that may have been the moment they felt safer acknowledging how much you still mattered to them. Because love becomes easier to approach when it no longer feels like a rescue mission. Pause on that. Their happiness may not be coming from the belief that you will now give them everything they want. It may be coming from realizing that you no longer need them to complete what only you could strengthen within yourself. That makes whatever exists between you feel more honest, more balanced, more possible. And perhaps this is why their emotions seem unusually strong now. They had prepared themselves for one version of the story. They expected you to remain exactly where they remembered you. But you quietly interrupted that expectation. You gave them a new piece of information. You showed them that people can grow without announcing every step. You showed them that distance does not always mean disconnection. Sometimes distance creates the space where clarity finally becomes possible. Don't skip the next part of this thought, because something subtle may have happened after they noticed your change. They began revisiting old memories through a different lens. A conversation that once felt unfinished may suddenly make more sense. A moment they interpreted one way may now look completely different. They may be realizing that some of what happened between you was not evidence that the connection meant nothing. It may simply have been evidence that both of you were trying to understand emotions you did not yet know how to carry. That does not rewrite the past. It does not erase mistakes. But it can soften the meaning attached to them. And when the meaning changes, the future can stop feeling like a repetition of everything that went wrong. This person may now be experiencing something surprisingly gentle, permission to remember you without immediately protecting themselves from what those memories bring up. That is a major emotional shift, even when nobody else can see it. One memory becomes a smile instead of a question. One old message becomes warmth instead of confusion. One thought of you lasts a few seconds longer because they are no longer rushing to push it away. And underneath all of that is the same realization: you finally did the one thing they hoped you would do. You became more peaceful without becoming indifferent. You became stronger without becoming closed. You became less reactive without becoming less caring. And if that is what they have been noticing, then their happiness makes perfect sense. Yet there is still something they have not figured out. They know what changed in you. They know how it made them feel. What they do not yet know is what they should do with that feeling. Should they keep it private a little longer? Should they wait and observe? Should they say something small and see how you respond? Should they let this new understanding settle before turning it into a conversation? That uncertainty is not necessarily a bad sign. Sometimes it means someone cares enough not to rush what suddenly feels important again. And that brings us to the quiet turning point. Their happiness is not only about what you finally did. It is about what your action made possible in their imagination. For the first time in a while, perhaps they can picture the two of you speaking without old expectations filling the room. They can imagine being honest without immediately defending themselves. They can imagine hearing your side without preparing an answer before you finish. And they may even be wondering whether the thing they secretly waited for was never an ending at all, but a sign that if another chapter ever began, it would not have to look anything like the chapter that came before. That is where this part leaves you, because there is one more realization forming quietly inside them now, and it has less to do with what you changed, and much more to do with what they are beginning to admit about themselves. Something inside them has become impossible to dismiss now, because the happiness they felt after noticing your change did not fade the way they expected it to. At first, they may have treated it like a passing emotion, a brief moment of warmth that would settle by morning, but instead it stayed. It followed them into quiet moments. It returned when they were doing ordinary things. It appeared unexpectedly when your name crossed their mind, and that is when they began to understand that this was not only about being impressed by what you did. It was about what your growth awakened inside them. For a long time, this person may have believed they were waiting for you to change, but now they are beginning to see something more uncomfortable and more beautiful at the same time. Part of the waiting was actually theirs. They were waiting for themselves to become ready enough to recognize what was already meaningful. That realization changes the entire emotional landscape, because suddenly they cannot place every unanswered feeling on the past anymore. They have to look inward. They have to ask why your calmer energy affects them so deeply. Why your emotional steadiness makes them feel relieved. Why seeing you move forward without bitterness somehow brings them closer to admitting that they never wanted to lose the connection completely. Don't skip, because this is where the story becomes less about what you proved and more about what they can no longer hide from themselves. There was likely a time when they convinced themselves that distance would make everything simpler. They may have thought that if enough time passed, the unanswered questions would become irrelevant. They may have believed that keeping certain feelings unnamed would make those feelings disappear. But emotions rarely follow neat instructions. Sometimes what is real becomes clearer when nobody is trying to force it. Sometimes the absence of pressure allows the truth to rise naturally. And now, after seeing something different in you, they may be realizing that the feeling they tried to categorize was never as simple as they told themselves. It was not just nostalgia. It was not only attachment to an old memory. There was genuine admiration underneath it, and your recent shift has made that admiration stronger. What moved them most was not the possibility that you might still be thinking about them. It was the possibility that you have become someone who understands yourself more deeply. That changes how they see every future interaction. Imagine how different it feels to think about reconnecting with someone when you no longer expect the same old tension. Imagine remembering their voice without immediately thinking about what went wrong. Imagine realizing that the person you once cared about has quietly developed the very qualities you always hoped they would discover within themselves. That is the kind of happiness forming here. It is not loud. It is layered. It carries surprise because they did not expect your growth to affect them personally, yet it does. Stay till the end, because there is one specific realization slowly taking shape beneath all of this. They may be recognizing that what they secretly wanted from you was never perfection. They wanted emotional safety. They wanted to feel that a conversation could happen without becoming a test. They wanted to know that silence would not automatically be interpreted as rejection. They wanted to believe that honesty could exist without either person needing to win. And what you finally did, whatever its exact form, gave them a glimpse of that possibility. Perhaps you responded gently where you once would have demanded clarity. Perhaps you accepted uncertainty without letting it define your worth. Perhaps you stopped trying to control an outcome and simply became honest about what mattered to you. Those may seem like small shifts from the outside, but to someone who has been quietly watching the emotional pattern between you, they can feel enormous. They tell a story without words. They say, "I can care and still remain grounded." They say, "I can feel deeply without turning those feelings into pressure." They say, "I have learned how to hold my own heart." And that may be exactly what this person needed to see before they could safely admit how much your presence still means to them. A strange thing happens when someone sees you become more secure in yourself. Their memories of you begin to separate from the tension that once surrounded them. Suddenly they remember your humor before they remember the misunderstanding. They remember how comfortable certain conversations felt before they remember why communication became complicated. They remember details they thought they had forgotten, the way you listened, the way you noticed something everyone else overlooked, the small kindness you probably assumed meant nothing. Those memories return because their mind no longer feels obligated to protect them from every emotional association connected to you. And that is why their happiness may feel almost confusing. They are not simply happy because you did something right. They are happy because your change has given them permission to see the connection with softer eyes. Something important is waiting for you, and it begins with a question they may now be asking themselves in complete privacy. What if I misunderstood what needed to happen? Maybe they once thought the relationship needed a dramatic solution. A perfect conversation. A clear sign. A single moment that would erase every uncertainty. But perhaps what needed to happen was quieter. Perhaps you needed time to become more centered. Perhaps they needed distance to recognize what they genuinely valued. Perhaps neither of you needed to become different people, maybe you simply needed to stop meeting each other through old expectations. That possibility can be deeply freeing. It means the future does not have to carry the exact emotional weight of the past. It means two people can learn separately and later discover that they now understand something they could not understand together. There is no guarantee hidden inside that truth, and that is what makes it grounded. It is simply an opening. A possibility. A new way of seeing something that once felt fixed. And this person may be feeling hopeful because your recent actions have shown them that the story is not frozen. You are not frozen. They are not frozen. The connection does not have to be reduced to its hardest moments. Now another layer begins to surface. They are starting to wonder whether you know what they have noticed. That question matters more than it seems. They may look at your calmness and wonder if you are simply living your life, completely unaware that your emotional shift has affected them. They may wonder whether your growth had anything to do with them at all. And perhaps, strangely, that makes it even more meaningful. Because if you changed only to get a reaction from them, the change would feel fragile. But if you changed because you genuinely chose peace, honesty, and self-respect, then what they are seeing feels real. That authenticity is what keeps pulling their attention back. You did not hand them a performance. You gave them evidence of something internal. That is much harder to ignore. Picture the moment they finally admitted this to themselves. Maybe they were alone. Maybe nothing remarkable was happening around them. Maybe they simply remembered something you recently did or said and felt that same unexpected warmth rise again. Instead of pushing it away, they allowed it to stay. And in that quiet moment, the thought may have formed, this is what I wanted for them. Not, this is what I wanted from them. Notice the difference. One is about receiving. The other is about caring. They wanted you to become more peaceful because some part of them always wanted to see you well, even when the connection itself felt uncertain. That realization may be one of the reasons their happiness feels so genuine. Your growth is giving them joy even before they know whether it leads anywhere. That tells them something about their own feelings. It tells them those feelings may be more generous than they previously understood. And once they see that, another truth becomes harder to avoid. They may still care about your future even if they are unsure what role they will have in it. That is not weakness. It is emotional honesty. Yet somewhere beneath that honesty, there is curiosity too. What would happen if the two of you spoke now? Would the conversation feel different? Would you hear each other more clearly? Would the pauses feel less threatening? Would there be room to laugh about things that once felt heavy? They may be imagining these possibilities without turning them into expectations. That is important, because healthy curiosity feels very different from desperate certainty. It leaves space. It allows both people to show up as they actually are. And perhaps that is the greatest change taking place here. They are no longer thinking only about how the connection could satisfy an old longing. They are beginning to wonder what a new kind of connection could honestly look like. The distinction is subtle, but powerful. Old longing says, "I want things to return to exactly what they were." New understanding says, "I wonder who we would be with each other now." And there is something surprisingly hopeful about that question. Don't skip the next realization, because this may be the part they have resisted admitting most. Your growth has also challenged them. Seeing you change means they can no longer comfortably assume that you were the only person who had something to learn. They may now be reflecting on their own patterns. Moments when they became distant instead of explaining what they felt. Times when they expected you to understand something they never clearly expressed. Situations where they protected themselves so carefully that they accidentally created more confusion. None of this requires blame. In fact, the opposite may be happening. They may finally be able to look at their own behavior with compassion rather than defensiveness. Your growth gave them a mirror without you ever holding one in front of them. That is rare. When someone improves quietly, it can inspire honesty in the people who once knew them closely. And now this person may be asking, if they can change, what have I learned? That question could become the real turning point. Because the future of any meaningful connection depends not on one person becoming perfect, but on both people becoming more aware. Perhaps they are starting to recognize that they also want to communicate differently. Perhaps they want to stop assuming. Perhaps they want to speak sooner when something matters. Perhaps they want to be clearer about what they appreciate instead of waiting until distance makes it obvious. These are not promises. They are beginnings. Small internal decisions forming before any outward action appears. And that is why the happiness in the title carries more depth than it first seems. They are happy because something you did gave them hope, but they are also happy because that hope is encouraging them to become more honest with themselves. The story is no longer simply, "You finally did what I wanted." It is becoming, "Your growth reminded me of who I want to be too." That is a far more meaningful connection. It turns admiration into reflection. It turns memory into possibility. It turns the past into information rather than a permanent destination. Now they are standing emotionally in a place they did not expect to reach. They can appreciate your progress. They can acknowledge their own feelings. They can imagine a calmer future. But one question remains unresolved, and it is becoming more important every time your name enters their thoughts. What do they do with everything they now understand? Do they simply carry this happiness quietly and allow it to remain private? Do they wait to see whether life naturally creates a moment between you? Or do they eventually take a small, sincere step that reveals just enough to let you know something has changed on their side too? They do not need a dramatic gesture. In fact, what they may be considering is surprisingly simple. A message. A gentle question. A reference to something only the two of you would understand. A small opening that does not demand anything but quietly says, "I see you differently now." And there is one reason they have not made that move yet. It is not because the happiness disappeared. It is because the feeling has become important enough that they do not want to approach it carelessly. They want to know whether this new emotional clarity is steady. They want to understand what they are truly hoping for before bringing you into it. They may even be waiting for one final realization inside themselves, a realization that will tell them whether they are simply grateful for who you have become, or whether the happiness they feel is pointing towards something they are finally ready to acknowledge. And that answer is beginning to rise, quietly, in the one place they can no longer avoid looking, their own heart. The answer they have been avoiding is beginning to feel much simpler than they expected, because every time they try to explain away this happiness, another quiet truth rises underneath it. This is no longer only about appreciating your growth from a distance. It is no longer only about feeling proud of the way you have changed. Something deeper is beginning to surface, and what surprises them most is how peaceful that realization feels. They thought admitting that you still mattered would create confusion. Instead, it is creating clarity. They thought remembering the connection would pull them backward. Instead, it is showing them how differently they now understand it. And this is where everything starts to shift again, because the one thing they secretly waited for may have opened a door they never expected themselves to walk toward. Not a dramatic door. Not a promise. Just the possibility of honesty. Don't skip, because what happens inside a person just before they become honest is often quieter than anyone realizes. They begin rehearsing conversations that may never happen. They imagine saying your name and noticing how it feels. They think about the questions they would ask if there were no pressure attached. They wonder which version of themselves would appear if the two of you were suddenly face to face again. Would they become guarded? Would they fall into old habits? Or would they finally be able to speak from the calmer place they have discovered within themselves? These questions are becoming important because they are no longer imagining you as you once were. They are imagining you as you seem to be now. And that changes everything about the emotional picture. The old version of the connection carried unfinished expectations. This new possibility feels lighter. There is more room in it. More patience. More respect. More space for two people to be honest without deciding the entire future in a single conversation. That may sound simple, but to someone who once associated this connection with uncertainty, simplicity can feel extraordinary. A quiet thought may now be repeating itself inside them. Maybe I don't have to know exactly where this goes in order to acknowledge what I feel. That is a powerful turning point. For so long, they may have believed that admitting affection required immediately defining it. They may have thought that caring meant choosing a destination before taking the first step. But now they are beginning to understand that sometimes the healthiest thing two people can do is simply tell the truth about where they are today. No pressure about tomorrow. No attempt to force meaning onto every word. Just honesty. And perhaps your recent change is what taught them that. You stopped trying to control every outcome, and now they are wondering whether they can do the same. There is something beautifully unexpected happening here. The very thing they once waited for from you is becoming something they now want to practice themselves. They wanted calm communication, so they are learning how to approach you calmly. They wanted emotional maturity, so they are examining their own responses. They wanted authenticity, so they are becoming less interested in pretending that nothing affects them. This is how genuine change can travel between people without either person demanding it. One person becomes more grounded, and the other suddenly feels invited to become more honest. Stay till the end, because there is another realization hidden inside their happiness, and it may be the most personal one yet. They have started noticing that they are not happy because you became easier to control, easier to predict, or easier to please. They are happy because you became more fully yourself. That distinction matters. Your confidence does not make them feel threatened. Your independence does not make them feel forgotten. Your peace does not make them feel unnecessary. Instead, those things may be showing them that if they ever became part of your life again, it could happen from choice rather than need. And being chosen by someone who can stand on their own feels very different from being needed by someone who is afraid to stand alone. That possibility may be touching something tender inside them. They may have always wanted to know that if you reached toward them again, it would not be because you had nowhere else to place your heart. It would be because, after everything you learned, you still saw something meaningful in them. They do not know whether that moment will happen. They are not assuming it will. But the fact that it now feels possible is enough to create a quiet kind of joy. And perhaps that is why they seem overwhelmed with happiness. It is not because a perfect ending suddenly appeared. It is because the connection no longer feels trapped inside an old story. For the first time, there may be room for something neither of you has experienced before, a fresh understanding between two familiar people. Think about how rare that can be. People often believe that second chances mean repeating the first experience with better intentions. But sometimes the real opportunity is completely different. It is not about restoring the old dynamic. It is about meeting again as people who have changed. The memories remain, but they do not have to control the conversation. The feelings remain, but they do not have to arrive with demands. The history remains, but it can become context instead of destiny. This person may be beginning to understand that distinction, and it is making them reconsider what they once thought was impossible. Something important is waiting for you, because their next realization is not about whether they should rush toward you. It is about why they kept holding back even after recognizing their happiness. Part of them may have feared that you had already moved beyond the connection completely. Not in a sad or dramatic way, but simply because your new calmness made you harder to read. When you stop chasing clarity from someone else, they can no longer use your pursuit as evidence of how you feel. When you become peaceful, your silence starts to mean many possible things. You could still care. You could simply be healing. You could be open to conversation. You could be content leaving things where they are. They do not know. And strangely, that uncertainty is forcing them to face their own intentions. They cannot approach you only because they assume you are waiting. They would have to approach because they genuinely want to. They would have to risk being honest without knowing exactly what you would say. And perhaps that is why your growth has become such a meaningful test for them too. The old dynamic may have allowed them to remain passive. If they believed you would always be the one reaching, they never had to fully decide what they wanted. But now you are standing differently. You are no longer sending the same emotional signals. You are not placing your life on hold. And suddenly the choice is clearer. If they want a conversation, they may eventually have to create one. That realization does not frighten them as much as it once might have. In fact, part of their happiness may come from discovering that they want to be brave enough to do it properly. Not impulsively. Not dramatically. Properly. With respect for you and respect for themselves. Maybe that begins with a simple message that does not pretend everything is already resolved. Maybe it begins with, "I've been thinking about you lately." Maybe it is even smaller, asking how you are and genuinely allowing the answer to be whatever it is. The important thing is not the exact words. The important thing is the intention behind them. They no longer want to communicate in a way that creates another puzzle. If they speak, they want the message to be clear enough that you do not have to spend hours decoding it. That alone shows how much their perspective may have changed. There was a time when ambiguity felt safer. Now honesty is beginning to feel safer. And that transformation may have happened because you showed them what emotional steadiness looks like. A surprising question may now be sitting inside their mind. What if the thing I admired most in them is becoming the thing I need to learn from them? That thought carries humility. It means they are no longer looking at the connection through the simple lens of who was right and who was wrong. They are asking what each person brought into the experience and what each person can take away from it. Perhaps you taught them patience without realizing it. Perhaps your absence taught them to appreciate directness. Perhaps watching you rebuild your peace taught them that vulnerability and strength can exist together. And maybe they are beginning to understand that caring for someone does not require controlling what happens next. Sometimes it simply requires being sincere when an opportunity appears. This realization is creating another emotional peak, because they are starting to imagine something they had not allowed themselves to imagine before, not a dramatic reunion, not a perfect future, but one honest moment where both of you are able to look at each other without carrying every old assumption into the room. Imagine the simplicity of that. Two people talking. Listening. Not racing ahead. Not searching every sentence for hidden meaning. Not trying to decide in 10 minutes what the next 10 years should look like. Just allowing the truth to exist. That possibility feels peaceful to them, and peace may be exactly what they were secretly waiting to associate with you again. Don't skip the next part of this, because their happiness may also be connected to a very specific memory. There may have been a moment in the past when they saw the calmer, more secure version of you for just a second. Maybe during a conversation when you surprised them with your understanding. Maybe when you showed compassion even though you were disappointed. Maybe when you walked away from an argument instead of trying to win it. That small glimpse stayed with them. They may not have spoken about it. They may not even have consciously remembered it often. But somewhere inside, they wondered whether that version of you would grow stronger with time. And now, seeing your recent choices, they feel as though the answer has arrived. You did not become someone completely new. You became more consistent with the best parts they had already seen in you. That is why this feels personal to them. They are not simply observing growth from a distance. They feel like they once caught a glimpse of what was possible, and now they are watching it become real. There is tenderness in that recognition. It can make someone feel connected to your journey even if they were not beside you for every step. Yet there is another truth they are beginning to accept: your growth belongs to you. They cannot claim it. They cannot treat it as something you accomplished for them. And oddly enough, respecting that fact may be making their feelings even stronger. Because they understand that you did not become more peaceful to impress them. You did not become more self-aware as a strategy. You did it because your life required it. You chose yourself. And now, If they ever become part of your story again, they know they would need to meet you where you are rather than asking you to return to who you used to be. That realization may be the most mature thought they have had about the connection. It means they are no longer asking, "Can we get back what we had?" They are asking, "Could we create something that fits who we are now?" Those are two completely different questions. The first looks backward. The second looks forward without pretending the past never happened. And somewhere between those two perspectives, their happiness is becoming less mysterious. They finally understand why your action affected them so strongly. It was proof that change is possible. Not change designed to win someone back, but real human growth that makes new choices possible. If you can grow, they can grow. If old patterns can soften, new conversations can happen. If two people can become more aware separately, perhaps they can eventually meet with more understanding than they had before. There is no need to force the next chapter into existence. That is another lesson they seem to be learning. Something meaningful does not become more real just because it happens quickly. In fact, they may now value slowness more than ever. They want clarity to develop naturally. They want whatever comes next, if anything does, to feel chosen rather than rushed. This is why they may be sitting with their happiness rather than immediately acting on it. They are listening to what the feeling is trying to tell them. They are separating genuine care from nostalgia. They are asking whether they miss you specifically or merely miss being understood. They are asking whether they are drawn to who you are now or simply to a memory. And every honest answer seems to lead them back to the same place: there is still something about you that matters. That does not automatically define what happens next, but it is enough to make them stop pretending the connection is emotionally irrelevant. Perhaps that is the confession they needed to make to themselves first. This still matters to me. Simple words. No pressure. No promise. Just truth. And once a person admits something like that privately, the world around them can begin to feel slightly different. They notice opportunities they would have ignored before. They become more attentive to coincidences, not because those moments guarantee anything, but because their heart is no longer closed to possibility. They may think of reaching out and then smile at themselves. They may wonder what you would say. They may imagine hearing your voice and realize that the thought does not feel heavy anymore. It feels warm. Familiar, but new. And there is one final detail forming quietly beneath all of this. They may soon realize that the one thing they secretly waited for was not actually the end of the waiting. It was the beginning of their responsibility. Once you showed them that you had changed, they could no longer remain comfortably hidden behind old assumptions. Now they must decide what kind of person they want to be if an opportunity appears. Will they continue watching from a distance, grateful but silent? Or will they eventually meet your honesty with some honesty of their own? That decision is still forming. But something has already changed inside them, because for the first time they are not asking whether you are capable of doing something different. You already showed them that. Now they are asking whether they are capable of doing something different too. And somewhere in that question lies the next revelation, because the answer they are beginning to give themselves may be the one thing neither of you expected.